I heard them decide my fate through a door that wasn't fully closed. Send the plain one north, my stepmother said, the way one might say dispose of the old linens. She'll only embarrass us during the season. Put her in the Hargrove cottage. It's remote enough that no one will ask questions, and cheap enough that it costs us nothing we'll miss. My father said nothing. He never did when it came to me. I stood in the corridor of our Cheapside townhouse with my hand pressed flat against the wallpaper, and I made myself breathe. I was 24. I had survived worse sentences than this one, but something about the way she said plain, not with cruelty, but with the bored certainty of someone sorting post into piles of important and rubbish, landed somewhere I thought I'd armored over years ago. What none of them knew, what none of them had bothered to discover, was that the Hargrove cottage sat at the edge of an estate called Ashworth Hall, and the Duke of Ashworth had been in London for exactly 3 days, settling a matter of business with my father's solicitor, when he overheard the very same conversation from the other side of that very same door. I didn't know that yet. I wouldn't learn it for weeks. But by the time I did, everything, my family, my future, and every lie I'd been told about my own worth, had already begun to collapse. They put me in a carriage before dawn. My half-sister Lucille was still asleep, her golden hair fanned across silk pillowcases, purchased with money my mother's dowry had provided, though no one in the household acknowledged this. My stepmother, Mrs. Felicity Aldworth, had married my father 6 years after my mother's death, and spent every year since erasing the evidence that Catherine Whitmore Aldworth had ever existed. The portrait above the mantel was replaced. The pianoforte my mother had played was sold. Her garden was paved over for a terrace where Felicity could host card parties. I had been allowed to keep exactly one thing, a cameo brooch that Felicity deemed too unfashionable to be worth confiscating. It sat at my throat now, cool against my skin, as the carriage jolted north through a grey February morning. My name is Eleanor Aldworth, and for the first 20 miles, I told myself this was a mercy. London during the season would have meant standing at the edges of ballrooms in last year's dress, while Lucille was paraded before titled men like a porcelain doll on a velvet tray. It would have meant Felicity's pointed comments about my height, my angular face, the way I read too much and smiled too rarely. It would have meant my father looking through me as though I were a window he had no interest in opening. The North, I told myself, meant solitude, and solitude meant I could finally breathe. But I had never been to the Hargrove cottage. I did not know its condition, its location, or its proximity to anything at all. I had been told only, it's habitable. There's a woman in the village who'll bring you meals. Don't write unless it's urgent. The journey took 4 days. By the time the carriage turned off the main road and onto a rutted track bordered by bare-branched oaks, I had finished the only book I'd been permitted to bring and had memorized the pattern of cracks in the leather seat. The cottage was stone, small, and freezing. It was also, I discovered upon opening the warped front door, directly visible from the south-facing windows of a house so enormous it seemed to occupy its own horizon. I did not meet the Duke of Ashworth on my first day, nor my second. I met his housekeeper. Mrs. Fenn arrived on my third morning, while I was attempting to coax the kitchen fire into something that might heat water. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with iron-grey hair pinned with military precision, and she stood in my doorway holding a basket of bread, cheese, and preserved plums, with the expression of someone who had discovered a stray animal in an outbuilding and was deciding whether to feed it or report it. "You're the Aldworth girl," she said, not a question. "I am Miss Aldworth, yes." Her eyes moved over the cottage, the damp walls, the single blanket on the narrow bed, the hearth that produced more smoke than warmth. Something in her face tightened. "This is unacceptable," she said. "It is what was arranged." "By whom?" "My family." Mrs. Fenn set the basket on the table with a firmness that suggested she was restraining herself from setting it down considerably harder. "The Hargrove cottage is a tenant property of the Ashworth estate. It hasn't been let in 4 years. I was not informed anyone would be occupying it." I felt the ground shift beneath my assumptions. "My stepmother said it belonged to us." "It does not." Mrs. Fenn looked at me with the particular steadiness of a woman who has managed a great house and will not be trifled with. "I shall need to inform His Grace." My stomach dropped. "His Grace?" "The Duke of Ashworth. This is his land, Miss Aldworth. You are his tenant, or rather, you would be, if anyone had troubled to arrange it properly." She glanced once more at the smoking hearth, the single candle, the absence of anything resembling adequate provision, which clearly no one has. She left before I could formulate a response that didn't sound like begging. That night, someone delivered firewood. Good firewood. Dry, split, stacked neatly beside the door. No note. No explanation. I burned it gratefully and tried not to think about the man in the great house, whose charity I was now apparently surviving on. I saw him for the first time on the 5th day. I had walked to the ridge above the cottage where the moor opened wide and the wind was sharp enough to scrub every thought clean. It was the only place I'd found where the sky felt larger than my circumstances. He was on horseback, a dark figure against the grey-green sweep of the hills, and he was completely still, watching. Not the landscape, me. The distance was too great for me to read his expression, but there was something in the way he sat, utterly motionless, with the coiled patience of a man who is used to observing before he acts, that made my skin prickle with awareness. I turned and walked back to the cottage. I did not run, but my heart was beating as though I had. The next morning, a package appeared on my doorstep. A woolen shawl, thick and well made, in a shade of deep blue that was nothing like the drab browns and greys my stepmother selected for me. Tucked inside was a card in a hand I did not recognize. "The moor wind is not kind to the underdressed. A." I should have returned it. A woman does not accept gifts from an unknown man, certainly not one identified only by an initial. But the shawl was warm, and my coat was thin, and the part of me that had been treated as disposable for so long felt something dangerous stir at the idea that someone had noticed I was cold. I kept it. I think that was the moment the trouble truly began. Mrs. Fenn returned 2 days later with a formal message. His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth, requested the pleasure of my company for tea at Ashworth Hall, that he might properly welcome his new tenant and discuss the terms of the cottage's occupancy. It was, on its surface, perfectly correct. A landowner meeting a tenant, chaperoned by his own housekeeper in his own home. There was nothing in it that even the most vicious gossip could twist. And yet my hands trembled as I pinned my mother's cameo at my throat. Ashworth Hall was everything the cottage was not. Vast, warm, meticulously maintained, with fires burning in every room I passed through, and the smell of beeswax and cedar hanging in the air. Mrs. Fenn led me through a long gallery lined with portraits of dark-haired men who all shared the same sharp jaw and watchful eyes, and then into a library that stopped me mid-step. Floor to ceiling, every wall, thousands of volumes, organized with the loving precision of someone who didn't merely collect books, but lived among them. "You found the heart of the house." His voice came from somewhere to my left, low, unhurried, with a roughness at its edges that suggested he did not use it often for pleasantries. I turned. The Duke of Ashworth was standing beside the fireplace, with one hand resting on the mantel, and he was nothing like what I had expected. He was perhaps 30, tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that wanted cutting, and eyes so pale they seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. There was no softness in his face. It was all angles and severity. But there was an alertness in his gaze that I recognized, because I had cultivated the same quality in myself. The look of someone who has learned to watch, because watching is safer than speaking. "Your Grace," I curtsied. My voice was steady. My pulse was not. "Miss Aldworth," he inclined his head. "Please, sit." We sat. Tea was poured. Mrs. Fenn positioned herself by the door with her needlework, close enough for propriety, far enough to allow conversation. "I must apologize for the condition of the cottage," he said. "It should not have been occupied without preparation. I've instructed my steward to see to the roof and the chimney. That is generous, Your Grace, but unnecessary. I do not wish to impose." "You are not imposing. You are freezing." A pause. "I am told your family arranged this situation without notifying the estate. I find myself curious about the circumstances." There it was, the question beneath the courtesy. "Why has your family sent you to a derelict cottage on a stranger's land in the dead of winter?" I could have lied. I could have offered some graceful fiction about wanting country air or needing rest. Instead, and I do not fully understand why, except that his eyes were very steady, and he did not look at me the way people in London looked at me, which is to say he did not look past me. I told him something closer to the truth. I was in the way. He said nothing for a long moment. "Then, in the way of what?" "My half-sister's season, my stepmother's ambitions, the general convenience of everyone who might benefit from my absence." "And your father?" "Agreed, as he agrees to everything she proposes." Another silence. The fire cracked. Outside, wind pressed against the windows. "They are wrong," he said quietly. "About what, Your Grace?" He looked at me then, not a glance, not the polite sweep of eyes that men perform in drawing rooms, but a direct, undisguised look that took in my face, my posture, the cameo at my throat, the way I held my teacup without trembling, even though something inside me was shaking. "About all of it," he said. I should have recognized the danger then. A woman alone in a remote county, dependent on the goodwill of a powerful man. This is the setup of a cautionary tale, not a romance. I knew that. I had read enough novels and seen enough of the real world to understand that kindness from men of rank comes with invisible invoices. But the Duke of Ashworth did not behave like a man preparing to collect. He behaved like a man who had forgotten how to be in a room with someone who interested him. Over the following weeks, our acquaintance developed through channels that were, on the surface, irreproachable. Mrs. Fenn invited me to use the Ashworth Library. "His Grace's instruction, miss. He says books should be read, not hoarded." I came twice a week, then 3 times. The Duke was not always present, but when he was, we would find ourselves in conversation that began with literature and ended somewhere far more personal. It was during one of these afternoons, a Thursday, I remember, because Thursday was when Mrs. Fenn visited her sister in the village, leaving the library door open and a footman stationed in the hall as substitute chaperone, that the conversation shifted onto ground neither of us had intended. We had been discussing Fordyce's sermons, which I had found on his shelf, and which amused me, because no man who actually believed Fordyce's prescriptions for female behavior would lend a woman free run of his library. "You disapprove of Fordyce," he said. He was leaning against the library ladder, arms crossed, watching me with that alertness I was beginning to understand was not coldness, but attention. I disapprove of the assumption that a woman's highest use is ornamental silence. Yes. And yet you are very silent. I am silent when I have nothing to say. That is different from being silenced. He moved then, just one step closer. But in the quiet of that room, it felt like a seismic event. You have a great deal to say, Miss Aldworth. I have noticed that you hold it behind your teeth, like someone hoarding provisions for a siege. My breath caught. Not because he was wrong, but because no one had ever looked closely enough to see it. Perhaps, I said carefully, I have learned that speaking is a luxury afforded to people whose words are considered worth hearing. Then you have been surrounded by fools. He was close enough now that I could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, the slight unevenness of his breathing, the way his hands were pressed flat against his own arms, as though restraining them from doing something else entirely. Your Grace. Thomas. It came out rough, almost involuntary, and the shock of it silenced us both. A first name, offered without invitation, without context, without any of the 1,000 gradual intimacies that were supposed to precede it. He stepped back as though burned. Forgive me, that was... Thomas, I repeated, barely above a whisper, and watched the word land on him like a physical blow. The footman coughed in the hallway. We separated to opposite ends of the room and did not look at each other for the rest of the hour. But my hands were shaking when I left, and through the library window, I saw him standing exactly where I'd left him, one hand pressed over his eyes. The letter arrived 3 weeks after I'd come north. Not for me, for him. But its consequences detonated across both our lives like a grenade lobbed through a window. Felicity had written to the Duke of Ashworth. I learned this from Mrs. Fenn, who learned it from his Grace's valet, who reported that the Duke had read the letter at breakfast and then left the table without a word, which he had not done in the 12 years of the valet's service. I did not know what the letter contained. Not yet. What I knew was this. The Duke did not appear in the library that week. The firewood deliveries continued, but the blue shawl felt like a relic from a different era. Mrs. Fenn's manner shifted, still kind but careful, the way people become when they are aware of something they cannot say. On the 7th day, I walked to Ashworth Hall uninvited. The footman who answered the door looked uncertain, but Mrs. Fenn appeared behind him and, after a moment's hesitation that told me everything about how irregular this was, led me to the library. He was sitting at his desk with the letter open in front of him. He looked as though he had not slept. Your stepmother, he said without preamble, has written to inform me that you are an opportunist of questionable morals, who was sent north to prevent you from embarrassing the family with an inappropriate attachment to a married solicitor. She urges me to have no contact with you beyond what landlord duty requires, lest you attempt to, I am quoting directly, attach yourself to a man of consequence through the same predatory cunning she deployed against Mr. Harwell. The room tilted. There is no Mr. Harwell, I said. My voice came from very far away. There was no attachment. There was no solicitor, married or otherwise. I know. I stared at him. How could you possibly know that? Because I had my solicitor investigate the claim before the ink on her letter was dry. He stood, and I saw then that the sleeplessness, the week of absence, had not been doubt about me. It had been fury on my behalf, carefully and methodically channeled into action. There is no Mr. Harwell in your father's professional circle. There is no scandal. There is nothing but a woman who saw her stepdaughter receiving kindness and moved to destroy it before it could take root. He came around the desk and placed a second document beside Felicity's letter. What I also discovered, and what I suspect you do not know, is that your mother's marriage settlement included a provision, a sum of £3,000 held in trust to be released to you upon your 25th birthday or upon your marriage. Your father has known this since her death. Your stepmother has known it since their marriage. Your birthday is in 4 months. The floor dropped away. £3,000. A fortune for a woman in my position. Enough for independence, a cottage of my own, a modest income, a life outside Felicity's control. And they had sent me to the remotest corner of England to ensure I would not learn of it. They were not hiding you from society, the Duke said quietly. They were hiding you from your own inheritance. I wept. I am not ashamed to admit it, though I despise the impulse toward tears, and have trained myself out of it in almost every circumstance. But the revelation that my exile was not merely cruelty, but strategy, that I had been disposed of like an inconvenient document to be dealt with after the relevant deadline, broke something open that I had kept sealed for years. He did not touch me. He stood 3 feet away with his hands locked behind his back, and his jaws set so tightly I could see the muscle working. And he let me grieve without trying to fix it. When I was finished, he handed me a handkerchief, plain white, monogrammed with a T, and said, "I will not allow this to stand." "Your Grace." Thomas. Thomas. I pressed the handkerchief against my eyes. "This is not your battle." "No," he agreed, "but I find I am unable to watch it from the sidelines." And then, because he was a man who had spent a decade building walls and had forgotten what it felt like when someone breached them, he said something that I believe cost him more than anything he had ever said in his life. "I have not been able to think clearly since the day you told me you were in the way. Because you are not in the way, Eleanor. You are in every thought I have. You are the only thing in any room that I can see. And I am aware that this is the worst possible time to say so, and that you have every reason to distrust a man offering you declarations when you have just learned you've been betrayed by your own family, but I—" He stopped. His voice had roughened to something barely controlled. "I cannot keep pretending that my interest in your welfare is purely that of a concerned landlord." The silence after he finished was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I looked at him, this severe, solitary man who had noticed I was cold, who had given me books instead of compliments, who had investigated a lie before he allowed himself to believe it. And I felt the last wall I had built shift on its foundations. "I know," I whispered. "I have known for weeks." He exhaled as though he'd been holding his breath since the moment I walked through his door. Neither of us moved. The distance between us felt like both a canyon and a choice. And for that moment, unbearable, electric, excruciating, we simply stood in it. But the world does not pause for private revelations. Felicity's letter had been the first strike. The second came by express post 2 days later. She and my father were traveling north. My half-sister Susan had secured a prospect, a baron's second son, and the family wished to present a united front. My presence at Ashworth Hall had reached London through some channel I could not trace, and Felicity intended to retrieve me before my proximity to a duke could complicate her carefully curated narrative. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, descending from the carriage in a flurry of expensive fabric and brittle smiles. My father looked exhausted. Lucille looked curious. Felicity looked like a woman marching to battle. The scene that followed took place in Ashworth Hall's drawing room, because the Duke, who had anticipated their arrival, because he had anticipated everything since the moment he read that letter, had invited the Aldworth family to tea with the same calm precision of a general choosing his terrain. Felicity opened with charm. She praised the estate, complimented Mrs. Fenn remarked on the beauty of the northern landscape, as though she had not, weeks earlier, called it nowhere. She sat in the best chair and accepted tea and directed conversation with the practiced ease of a woman who has been performing social authority for years. Then she turned to me. "Eleanor, darling, you look well. The country air has done you good. But I think it's time you came home. The cottage has served its purpose, and we shouldn't impose on His Grace's generosity any longer." "The cottage," the Duke said mildly, "is mine, as is the decision of who occupies it." Felicity's smile flickered. "Of course, Your Grace. I only meant—" "You meant to remove Miss Aldworth from my estate before she discovers the trust her mother established for her. The one that matures in 4 months." The room went cold. My father's teacup rattled in its saucer. Lucille looked between us with dawning comprehension. Felicity went absolutely still. Not the stillness of composure, but the stillness of a predator who has realized she is not the largest thing in the room. "I don't know what Eleanor has told you," Felicity began. "Miss Aldworth told me nothing. My solicitor told me everything." The Duke's voice had not risen. It did not need to. "The trust was established by the late Mrs. Catherine Aldworth in 1799 and is held with Coutts and Company. It names Eleanor as sole beneficiary. The documents were filed with your husband's full knowledge, Mrs. Aldworth, and your subsequent failure to inform Eleanor of its existence is, at best, a profound breach of familial duty." "This is family business," Felicity hissed, all pretense abandoned. "It does not concern you." "It concerns me," the Duke said, "because you sent a vulnerable woman to my land with the intention of burying her where no one would notice. And because the letter you wrote, the one in which you fabricated an entirely fictional scandal to poison her reputation in my eyes, constitutes defamation, which is very much a legal matter." Felicity turned to my father. "Edward, say something." My father looked at me. For the first time in years, he actually looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. And what I saw in his face was not anger or defiance, but the grey, exhausted recognition of a man who has known for a very long time that he is complicit in something indefensible. "It's true," he said quietly. "All of it. The trust. The letter. I should have—" He stopped, swallowed. "I should have done a great many things." "You should have protected your daughter," the Duke said. There was no mercy in his voice. "You chose comfort. That is a choice you will live with." I stood then. My legs were unsteady, but my voice was not. "Felicity." I waited until she looked at me. She did not want to, but the force of my address compelled it. "You have spent 6 years trying to make me invisible. You sold my mother's piano. You paved her garden. You told me I was plain and difficult and fortunate to be tolerated. And I believed you. I believed every word. Because when you hear something often enough from the people who are supposed to care for you, it stops sounding like cruelty and starts sounding like truth." My voice cracked, but I did not stop. "But it was never true. I am not plain. I am not difficult. And I am not in the way. I am Catherine Whitmore's daughter, and I have her face and her stubbornness and her trust fund, and you will never take another thing from me." The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound of my life. They left the next morning. Felicity spoke to no one. Lucille, to my surprise, embraced me at the carriage door and whispered, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." My father pressed my hand and could not meet my eyes. I let him go. There would be time, perhaps, for something more complicated than forgiveness. But not today. The Duke found me on the ridge that afternoon. The moor was gold and grey under a sky threatening rain, and the wind was sharp enough to justify the blue shawl I had wrapped twice around my shoulders. He stood beside me in silence for a long moment, looking out over his land. Our land, in a sense, since I was now properly his tenant with a signed agreement and a repaired chimney. "You were magnificent," he said. I was terrified. Those are not mutually exclusive. He turned to face me, and for the first time since I had known him, his expression held no guardedness at all. It was open in a way that made him look younger, less like a duke and more like a man standing on a hillside, hoping very badly that he would not be sent away. "Eleanor, Thomas, I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you construct a perfectly reasoned argument for why it's impractical." A sound escaped me that might have been a laugh. "I make no promises." "I have lived in that house for 10 years, he said. "I have managed the estate, attended to my duties, fulfilled every obligation that was placed on me when my father died. And I have done all of it alone, because I believed that solitude was the price of the position. That caring for someone would be a vulnerability I could not afford." The wind pressed my shawl against my body. I did not move. "Then you arrived in a derelict cottage with one book and a cameo brooch and absolutely no intention of being rescued, and you ruined every theory I ever had about what I needed." He stepped closer. One step. The distance between us was the width of a breath. "I am not offering you rescue, Eleanor. You have demonstrated beyond any doubt that you do not require it. I am offering you, if you want it, partnership. A life. Mornings in the library arguing about Fordyce. Someone who will never look through you." I was crying again. I did not care. "I want that," I said. "I want all of that." He lifted his hand, slowly, carefully, as though approaching something precious and breakable, and touched my face. His fingers were warm despite the cold, and the gentleness of it undid me more completely than any grand gesture could have. "May I?" he asked, quiet, almost uncertain. "Yes." The kiss, when it came, was not the careful, restrained press of lips that propriety demanded. It was slow and deep and shaking, and it tasted like wind and waiting, and the end of a very long winter. His hand curved around the back of my neck, and mine fisted in the front of his coat, and for one suspended, perfect, annihilating moment, neither of us was alone. The scandal, of course, was considerable. A Duke of Ashworth marrying a woman of no significant family, no beauty by London standards, and no social consequence, was the kind of gossip that fueled drawing rooms for months. But the bride's own stepmother had attempted to sabotage the match, and that the Duke had responded by exposing the attempted theft of an inheritance only added fuel. The Morning Post ran 3 separate items. Lady Castlereagh was said to have called it the most entertaining thing to happen north of York in a century. We married in the chapel at Ashworth Hall in April, 2 weeks before my 25th birthday. The trust matured on schedule. I donated a portion to a school for girls in the village, the kind of place where a young woman might learn that she was worth something before the world spent years teaching her otherwise. Mrs. Fenn wept at the wedding and denied it afterward. Lucille visited that summer. She was kinder than I'd allowed myself to believe, and we began the slow, cautious work of building something that might, in time, resemble sisterhood. My father wrote once. I wrote back. It was a beginning, not a resolution, and I did not pretend otherwise. The cameo brooch sits now in a glass case in the library, beside the card that read, "The more wind is not kind to the underdressed." A. Thomas had it framed. I told him he was being sentimental. He said he was preserving evidence. Some evenings, when the light goes low and the fire burns to embers, I walk to the ridge above the cottage. The moor stretches out in every direction, wild and open and impossibly large. And I stand in the wind and feel the full, terrifying, magnificent weight of being seen. They sent me north to disappear. Instead, I was found.